Okay, well, God bless everybody. So glad you're here. Such a blessing for me to be with you tonight. Thank you for taking the time to be here and wanting to spend this time fellowshipping in your word and learning about God and understanding him better. We're going to continue in our study of the foundational truths of Genesis. Last week, we completed Genesis 18. And you'll remember that Abraham had three visitors at the Oaks of Mamre, and we know that's between right over there near Ai and Bethel. We looked at that on the map, and God had two angels with him, Sarah and Abraham, through a wonderful meal, which is huge abundance, with far more than what they could eat. But that was their custom and wonderful hospitality they had. And during that time, there was a discussion regarding Sarah and the promise, and that she would have a child the next year. And they talked about Sodom and what would take for God to not destroy the city. And you'll recall the countdown from the 50 all the way down to 10 that Abraham did with God. So it was determined that there was less than 50 in the city, and the two angels headed out for the destruction to carry out God's will on what needed to be done. So tonight we'll be in Genesis 19. If you like to turn there, we'll be discussing the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and go into some of the details. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let me make sure I've got my REV. Yeah, of course, I teach out of the REV. And we're going to start in Genesis 19. And I'm not sure where that's that way, but fix that. Oh, okay. Now, just a second. All right. Okay, so we're going to go into Genesis 19 in verse 1. And so I will share my screen. And here we go. So Genesis 19, and starting in verse 1. Okay, the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom, and Lot saw them, rose up to meet them, and bowed down, with his face to the earth. Now, these are the two angels that were with God, who ate dinner with God and um, Abraham, and that Sarah prepared for them. And as we left in verse 19, they headed towards Sodom, and we know that Abraham could see Sodom from where he stood. So our understanding is that Sodom is just on the other side of the valley there. And you could see it from the hill, the higher elevation where Abraham was near Ai and Bethel, the Oaks of Mamre. And you could see down and you could see Sodom across the valley there on the other side of the Jordan. And so they headed on down, and um, God had stayed behind, as you recall, and he was talking with Abraham. So the fact that Lot is sitting at the gate here, it says, that it shows that he has a good position, a position of respect and honor, because it was very common at time for the king to actually sit at the gate, because people would enter the city. This was obviously a walled city. Sodom was walled, and there would be a gate, and the gate where people would sit and talk. And if you had a need, sometimes judges would be there, as in the case of sanctuary cities where people who had done manslaughter and needed protection from the relatives, they would come there, and the judges would make their decrees. Also, elders would be there, and they would just deal with things that were going on in life. And so they were judges. They would judge righteously, and they would sit at the gate. Now, during our Bible Land tour, we saw some city ruins, and sometimes they would have a double gate. And a double gate is interesting in that you have the first gate, which you would go into, and then there would be a passageway. And then along the passageway, there'd be these high walls, and there would be like a parapet up there, a kind of little fortress where soldiers could hide or stand and have their spears and their arrows and whatever else they had, because you had to get, if you were an enemy, not only did you have to get through the first gate, you had to get through the second. And while you're trying to get through the second gate, guess what happens? You get shot. So they had set this up to protect their cities by having these double gates, and the warriors would be there on those parapets and take care of it. So there's a couple references here. I'm going to show you just a couple. You're probably familiar with this. We're going to go back to looking you. I had this queued up for some reason. It did not want to redo. So, okay, maybe I can do this. Okay, now it's going to be that way about it. That's okay. I'll just use another tab here. Just hang on with me for just a minute. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go to Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 22 and in verse 15. The nice thing, this gets you where you're going pretty quick. So Deuteronomy 22:15. And then the father of the girl and her mother, the father of the girl, here, one moment. The father of the girl and her mother are to take and bring out the evidence of the girl's virginity to the elders at the gate of the city. And the girl's father is to say to the elder, and then what would happen is they would just deal with their particular grievances that they would have, and they would go to the gate, because at the gate, there's always somebody there that can deal with whatever difficulties they were having. In Joshua chapter 20, let's look at that one, verse 4. And this has to do with that sanctuary city that I mentioned to you earlier. He is to flee to one of those cities. This is for a person who accidentally or unintentionally kills someone. But there's an avenger of blood. Sometimes the family doesn't take kindly, no matter how, if it was accidentally or not. So they were told, God set it up. You go to a sanctuary city, and they would flee to these cities and stand at the entrance of the gate of the city and declare his cause to the ears of the elders. He would tell them why he was there, and they would take him into the city with them and give him a place so that he may live among them. So these people oftentimes had to live in sanctuary cities to protect them. In verse 5, if the avenger of blood pursues him, then they must not deliver up the killer into his hand, because he struck down his neighbor unintentionally and did not hate him previously. So it was not a premeditated murder. So you have your elders in the gate in the city, and this was very common. Even King David, when he wanted to talk to his people, he would go to the gate, and they would have access to him and they could talk. So this is where Lot was. So Lot was given a position where he was trusted with being a good judge, that he was a righteous person. He could judge righteously. And this thought, hold on to this thought, because it's going to come up later, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. So we're back in Genesis chapter 19, verse 2. And he said, behold now, lords. Now this is Lot talking to the angels. Now, behold, my lords, this is a common greeting. It's like saying sirs when you don't know someone. This is not a special greeting. Please turn aside into your servant's house, spend the night, wash your feet, and then you can rise up early and go on your way. But they said, no, rather we will spend the night in the city square. And it's pretty common in these cities. Once you go through the second gate, it usually opened up into a square. And so they would stay there. And it was not uncommon for people to stay in the square. Sometimes there'd be lodging, etc. But what's going on is that cultural thing, which we've heard out over the years, where they normally don't accept invitations on the first request. So see what happens in verse 3 here. But he pressed them strongly. He pressed them strongly. That means he's going to ask them several times. So they turned aside with him and went to his house. So he pressed them strongly. They came to his house, and he made a banquet. And this kind of a banquet, this word for banquet is actually for a very special meal, which would include wine. And he baked unleavened bread. So they were able to eat faster, because as you know, unleavened bread doesn't take near as long as bread. So I usually think of unleavened bread as like biscuits, something like that. I don't think they eat cornbread, but stuff that is without yeast. So it rises quickly. And so he made a banquet for them and they ate. So that takes time. It was in the evening, if you notice up here in verse 1, they came to Sodom in the evening. And so Lot took them home and they had a banquet. Now, time is it's getting later in verse 4. Uh, Before they lay down, now this before we go to bed, before they all went to bed, it was in the evening, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house. Now this is pretty interesting because it's I think you all have heard of hyperbole, and hyperbole just is like an exaggeration. What it's communicating is that the this type of behavior was throughout the city. Now, of course, there are going to be men too old, or people that are sick, or boys too young to participate in such an event as here. And also, as you know, later on, we'll see the sons-in-laws of Lot's daughters. They didn't participate. So it doesn't mean every last person. It's just a hyperbole to show that this wickedness was throughout the city. So in verse 5, and they called out Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight?" Now, of course, we know these men as angels, but they looked like men. "Bring them out to us so that we can know them sexually." Now, this is pretty disgusting, but this tells you why God's going to get rid of this city and Gomorrah as well, because it was evil in the extreme. Whoever does such a thing? I've never witnessed such a thing. This is just beyond bizarre, but this is what they did. These were uh, sodomites, and that's what they wanted to do. And then we see some things that are pretty strange here. Um, because Lot goes out to them. So see, they're in the house, the angels in the house, the family's in the house. He goes out to the entrance and shuts the door behind him. And so he's going to address them. And he's going to say, "Please, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." Now, by calling them brothers, he was not trying to win them over. This is just polite speech. These men were not his brothers, they were Canaanites, but it was polite speech. And behold, now this is something, this is the bizarro world we're going into now. It's very difficult for the Western mind to understand because behold, now I have two daughters who have not known a man. So that means he's got two virgin daughters. They could have been very young. We're going to talk about this later. They could have been betrothed to their husbands to be. And in those cases, as you know, when you were betrothed in the East or you were promised, it was like a marriage. Even though they did not come together, they had to get a written divorce to end that betrothal even before they were married. So it could have been these two young women were very young and were not betrothed, but we don't know. So he says, "Let me bring them out to you and do whatever is good in your eyes." Who would ever do that? In our Western mind, most men say, "Yeah, you're going to go through me before you get to them." You got to, it's like over my dead body. It's such an interesting cultural thing. It was such their hospitality rules were so sacred to them that they would go beyond good judgment. This is doing something beyond good judgment in what we would call good judgment. But to them, that's what they did. "Only do not do anything to these men because they have come under the shadow of my roof." So he's being hospitable to these two men in the extreme by offering his daughters to these wicked men instead of these other men. And so they didn't care for that idea. They were homosexuals. They were interested in the men. So they said in verse 9, but they said, "Stand aside." And then they said, "This one came as a sojourner." They're talking to Lot, like in the third person, as if they're talking among themselves. "This one came as a sojourner and he's behaving like a judge." Well, he was a judge and he was a sojourner. Remember, he was out on the plains originally near Sodom with his herds, and then for some reason he chose to move into Sodom. And when he did, he was appointed a judge. So he was probably, I can see where Lot, being the type of background he probably had good judgment. Um, where the people of Sodom were probably just, beyond evil and didn't have good judgment. So they wanted him to be involved. Now we will deal worse with you. Now they threaten him. We're going to deal worse with you than with them. And they press strongly against the man, against Lot, and drew near to break the door. Now, these words strongly, we read about them a little bit earlier. And so it's funny that Lot pressed them strongly to stay in his house. And now, in a tremendous change of events, a 180, now the wicked people are pressing the angels strongly to come outside. Kind of interesting how God uses these words in two very dramatically different things. So in verse 11, we're into, and it's kind of interesting. There's so much evil that these guys, Lot and his family were, um, they were exposed to, and I often wonder why they chose to live there, and why it was bad enough outside the city, why they moved in the city. It's hard to know because we don't know all the details. But this is what happened in verse 10. The men reached out their hands, and these men are these angels. So here Lot is outside the door talking to these wicked people. And so they open the door, stick out their arm, grab Lot and pull him back in, shut the door. And these angels struck the men who were at the door of the house with blindness, young and old. So we've got this whole group here. This is quite a wild event here. You got all these men, young and old, trying to break the door down, trying to get to these angels. Probably a huge crowd. We don't know. Just that there's lots of people. So they struck him with blindness. Now, at first, you might think this is just physical blindness, but it doesn't seem so. There's other places in the Bible where people were considered blind, but not literally. You probably remember Matthew 15, where let the blind, if the blind lead the blind, they'll both fall in the ditch. And this was talking about leading them with wrong doctrine. So it's kind of a mental confusion or mental wrong teaching. So not necessarily literal, but had kind of the overtone so you could understand the story. So they'll both fall in the ditch. And there's other places. I think I've got one here in Exodus. I've got that set up here. Let's look at Exodus chapter 23 and in verse 8. Oops, let me go back here. And in verse 8. You must not take a bride, for a bride blinds those who have sight and prefers the words of judgment. So you can see what the point is that are in these two records where I'm talking about is blindness can be considered something other than physical blindness. And this is why we think it is. If you take a look at this, we'll go back here to Genesis 19. And at the end of the verse, they were blind so that they became weary trying to find the door. So, okay, say for instance, you're at this event and all of a sudden you have sight, and now all of a sudden you're as blind as a post. I think if that would have occurred, you are going to change your priorities very quickly. These men were seeing, and then all of a sudden they couldn't see, and yet they're still trying to find the door. I think that's kind of bizarre. So we think it's more of a mental confusion. They're kind of like, I'm here, supposed to do something, not quite sure. And they just got confused and they kept looking for the door and just got all confused and couldn't find it. So that's one way to look at it. You may see this a little bit differently, but I think that's a good way to look at this, at least something to consider here. So they got weary. Now let's take a look here in the next verse. Then the men said to Lot, now we're inside. The guys are outside trying to find the door. And the angels now are talking to Lot. And he says, do you have anyone else here? Like sons-in-laws, your sons, your daughters, all that you have in the city, bring them out of this place. So it's now this particular time, he says, bring them out. and because it's time to get out of here and things are going to start gearing up. They want to know if there's anyone else in there. And in a moment, we'll see that Lot did have sons-in-law, which could indicate there were maybe other daughters besides the two that that were still virgin daughters. There's a lot of discussion on this subject, and people don't know. Could have been, could have not been. So we don't know, but we do know he had two daughters that are referred to in this account, and he had sons-in-laws, and those sons-in-laws could have very easily been betrothal. It could have been like Joseph and Mary. They were betrothed but had not come together. They weren't officially married. This could have been the situation here, and we don't know. So let's take a look at the next verse here, 13. For we are about to destroy the city because the outcry against them is so great before the face of Yahweh that Yahweh has to send us to destroy it. So these are the two authorized angels to be there to be involved with the destruction of the city. And we are about to destroy it. And, this is kind of, people say, well, that's pretty intense. Well, yes, it is. It's an intense thing. But we got to think about, too, that God really is the owner of the earth. It belongs to him. Now, he offered dominion to Adam and Eve, as we know, and he has a legal right to do what he wants to with the earth. And that's what he did. We studied the record of Noah's flood. And so he eradicated the whole earth of evil during the flood because it's within his right. Now in Sodom, the people were so wicked, he decided to rid the earth of them, which was his righteous choice. And he also did that, as you know, with Joshua and the Canaanites and King Saul. He can rid people of evil when he chooses to. So let's take a look here. I want to take a look in Deuteronomy chapter 9. I think I may have this set up. Nope. So we're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 9. And in verse 4, after Yahweh had thrust them out before you, do not say in your heart, because of my righteousness, Yahweh has brought me in to possess the land, because Yahweh drives them out before you because of the wickedness of the nation. So God has the right to drive out people off of his property if he so chooses. Now, his mercy and his grace, a lot of times evil people just get to live here on the land. But he's always we all look forward to the day where those who are righteous will inherit the land, that we will live on the land. We know that from the Lord's Prayer, that the righteousness will inherit the land and the wickedness will leave. Let's get back to Genesis, and we're back in verse 14. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were takers of his daughters in marriage, and said, get up, get out of this place, for Yahweh's about to destroy the city. But in the eyes of his sons-in-law, he was as one who was joking. They did not take him seriously, to their demise. So they thought it was a joke, and so they didn't go. Now, so time is going by here. In verse 15, and when the dawn arose, okay, it's starting to get to be, the dawn is coming. All this stuff has gone through most of the night, but it looks like that there was some sleep, because there's this exclamation to get up. The dawn arose, and the angels urged Lot on, saying, get up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away because of the iniquity of the city. So some time is going by because it's dawn, and the angels tell Lot to get up and take his two daughters because the city's going to be destroyed. In verse 17, but he hesitated. I understand in some degree, this was a big decision, just to grab your kids and go. This is kind of like leaving a burning house. You've got your home here, you got your possessions, you got your photos, you got your prescriptions, you got whatever you got, and all this stuff there. And so he hesitated, didn't want to. So what happened was, there are two men, each of these two men had two hands, of course. So they grabbed his wife's hand and his two daughters' hands, and they grabbed his hand and they brought them out and left him outside the city. So here you are, you got these two angels, you can see them, the two daughters on one angel, or however they set it up, and then Lot and his wife with the other guy, and they just take them out of the city. So they bring them outside of the city. So here we are in verse 17. And when they had brought them out, one of them said, one of the two angels, escape for your life. Do not look behind and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Escape to the hill country or you will be swept away. So there's the command. It's very clear. So they took him out, to, away from the city, but not all the way out. They still were going to have to move out. They still were in danger. And God respects people. This shows kind of how God respects people's freedom of will. We probably experienced this in our lives. He takes us up to a certain point, but we have to go the extra mile. And this is a good lesson. So God gets us on the right path, and then it's up to us to keep going. And so this is what he was doing with Lot and his wife and the two daughters. And he said, don't look back. This is very important here because one of them's not going to obey. And do not stop anywhere in the plain. This is very important because one of them is not going to obey. And there are consequences in not following what God says to do. And he says, escape to the hill country. So the specific command was to go to the hill country, not just somewhere on the plain, go to the hill country or you'll be swept away. Okay, so Lot doesn't quite like that idea. So he says to them, please, no, Lord. So let's look at this here. They were told not to stop anywhere on the plain, but escape to the hill country. And Lot didn't want to do that. Verse 19, behold, your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown me great faithfulness by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hill country. I don't know why he said that, lest this disaster overtake me and I die. So he says, look, the city is close enough to escape to, and it is small. Let me escape there. Isn't it small? And my soul will live. So apparently, the angels told him to go to the hill country, and he finds this little city, which is not in the hill country, it's on the plain. So it looks like God had really planned to not only destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, but all these smaller cities that were on the plain. That's why he said, go to the hill country. But Lot makes a request to not have to go that far. And he said to him, behold, the angel said, I will grant you this request. I will not overthrow the city of which you had spoken. So there were plans to overthrow that city. And if there was a plan to overthrow that city, what does that tell you? It was a wicked city. There must be these same abominations or similar going on there. And then in verse 22, we talk about the name of the city. Be quick, escape to there, for I cannot do anything until you get there. That is why the name of the city was called Zor, which meant small. So this is a small city that's in the plain. There is a Zor that we talked about where the possible place of Sodom, the most likely place of Sodom is on the north side of the Dead Sea, because that fits with the other records that give you a kind of triangulation on where it was in relationship to Jerusalem. And there was a Zor near there. So we don't know the exact site of Zor, but they're pretty sure they know where Sodom was. And I showed you that video clip last week that indicated where it was and what the evidence was for why they believe that. So now we got some time going by. It takes Lot and his wife and the two girls a little while to get to Zor. And the sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zor. So it took a little time. And let's look at verse 24. Then Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur. Sometimes you'll hear brimstone. Brimstone and sulfur are the same thing. And sulfur and fire, it was from Yahweh out of the heavens. So you have this burning sulfur and fire. And if you've ever had brimstone or some sulfur, it is easily ignited. And we purchased some sulfur not long ago and we're able to ignite it. And it's kind of interesting. And if you check out the internet, there's some evidence of them finding these balls of pure sulfur in this area. And so they it indicates that there was some leftover sulfur and they lit it up and gave you a demonstration. So if you're interested in seeing some of that, I didn't, the quality was not good enough for me to share it, and the certainty of the place, I was not convinced, but it is interesting if you want to take a look on YouTube under destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay. In verse 25, and Yahweh overthrew those cities and all the plain. Now, so he's hitting the cities and the plain. Of course, he didn't get Zor and all the inhabitants of the cities. So all of the inhabitants died. All these people that were trying to get to the angels are dead. The sons-in-laws are dead. The inhabitants of the cities are dead. And there's these two cities, and there's several suburban cities around there. And the vegetation on the ground was burned up. Okay, now here we come into the problem with Lot's wife. We don't know her name, but this is what we're going to look at this record now. But his wife looked back. So she broke the command. She was not to look back. We just read that just up here, just a few verses ago, where it was given her to a very, very clear command on not stopping and not looking back. But she did anyhow. And to her demise, his wife stopped and looked back. And this work looked is, from my understanding, it's not like just glanced, looking over your shoulder. It was a gazing, a looking back. So she apparently stopped somewhere behind Lot. And it's common in the East for wives to walk behind their husbands. So he may not have known that she had lingered and dallied around, and she stayed in the danger area. She looked back and she became a pillar of salt. And we've heard this story probably many times about the pillar of salt. It's oftentimes confused saying, oh, she became a statue. Now, the word for pillar is not statue. As a matter of fact, in other places, it's translated representative, or even an overseer or a soldier. So what it seems to be is this pillar of salt, this pile of salt that was left behind, became representative of what she did. And I'm sorry to say, bless her heart, she made two bad decisions. She stopped and she looked back, and she did not get out of the way fast enough. And I would say it was kind of like an instant cremation. At least that's my terminology. And I looked up how much salt is in the human body, and I found out there's approximately 9 ounces. 8 ounces is a half a pound. So that's a substantial amount. And if you had a pile of salt on the ground, you could see that. And so it seems that's what we have behind here. She was destroyed by the fire, the brimstone, the sulfur that came out of the sky, and was burned up into ashes very quickly. And they could see the salt that had remained. Sad ending to her life. Verse 27. And Abraham started early in the morning. Now we're changing settings here. We're now talking about Abraham. So we're back, kind of like back at the ranch. Abraham's back up there on the hill. He's in that Ai Bethel area, the Oaks of Mamre. But he gets up early in the morning and goes to the place where he stood before Yahweh. And we know that wasn't too far from his original encampment. We don't know if that's probably where he still is. So he gets up and he goes over to the place where he stood with Yahweh, and he looks out towards Sodom and Gomorrah. And we looked at him seeing that earlier when after the meal that his wife and he had prepared for the angel and God, two angels and God. And he looks towards Gomorrah and toward the plain, the land of the plain, and he looks, and behold, it's all burn up in smoke. The land went up like a smoke of a kiln. Now, kilns are I don't know if you've ever seen a wood-fired kiln, but they're used for bricks. And some of you who've ever done pottery, you have electric kilns and you heat the stuff up. There is a married couple who got their masters in pottery, believe it or not, on my way to Taos, and they have a wood kiln and they make very natural pottery. They don't use any unnatural dyes or anything like that. And they get together. I asked them, well, you don't have electric kiln? They said, no, we use wood. He said, I said, how much? Oh, he says about 3 or 4 cords. That's a lot of wood. And they do it once a year and they make all the pottery they need for their sales in 1 year. So this is kind of a smoky thing. It was like a kiln. Now, in a kiln, you can also see fire coming out of the sides, and don't know exactly what Abraham saw, but that's kind of what it was. This kiln down here. So now in verse 28, we'll continue. So he looked out toward Sodom and toward all the land, and he looked up, and the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a kiln. In verse 29, and when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered Abraham and Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities where Lot had settled. So what this is telling us is God remembered Abraham. This is a good lesson for us because Abraham did a really good job to live the best he could, very righteously. He was a believer. He lived a good life. And we know that God honors our desires to live righteously. There's the verse that you all recall, I'm sure, where it talks about the prayers of a righteous person are very effective. And so God honors this stuff, honors this desires in people. So our righteous living can actually save other people's lives. Now that's pretty amazing that God does that, but that's exactly what he did for Abraham. And we just read it in that verse that Abraham was because of the relationship Abraham had with God, Lot was saved. So let's just take a look at that again just for another moment. I'll stop. I'll share again. And when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. So he remembers Abraham and he takes care of Lot and out of the midst of the overthrow where the cities where Lot had settled. So I think that's pretty interesting. And so now we move into another situation here. And I'm just going to read the first couple of verses here because I don't want to take the whole time to finish out this chapter. But there are a couple of things I'd like to do here. In verse 30, Lot went up out of Zoar. Okay, so he was in Zoar, right? And so he went up out of Zoar and settled in the hill country. That's where he was originally told to go to escape the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But he went to Zoar first, but he didn't stay there. Now it's kind of interesting that he didn't stay there. Well, not really too surprising because Zoar was on the list of towns to be destroyed because they were in the plain. So probably was not a good city to live in. So he and his 2 daughters with him, for he was afraid to live in Zoar, must have been evil. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. Now that's not uncommon. When we were at the Bible Lands, we saw there are caves. There's caves all over the place. And caves are very common there, and people sometimes would choose to do that. But the question is, here he's got this wonderful uncle, Abraham, that is just, not very far away, because Abraham could see Sodom and Gomorrah from where he was. So it's not too far away. So why didn't he go back to his uncle? Kind of a curious thing. And it looks like we know at one time Lot had huge herds and flocks. That's why Abraham said, hey, we got too many. Why don't you pick out some land where you want to live and I'll take whatever you don't. And that's when Lot took the best land down in these plains that were rich and well watered from the Jordan River. And he took his flocks and he was very wealthy. But now it seems that all these flocks have been, and these herds are gone, destroyed with everything else. And so instead of Abraham, Lot is always an interesting character to me, because um, if you take the Bible very literally, it's almost as if he shouldn't have been on this trip in the first place, because God told him to leave all of his family behind and head out to where he was going to send him. But Lot went, and Lot has seemed to be a focus of problems. His herders fought with Abraham's herders. That's why they split up the land. And then Lot took the best of the land, he took first and saying, Abraham, you go first. And then Lot gets into trouble. He gets kidnapped, and Abraham has to um, fight a war over him. And all this difficulty. There's so much drama in his life. And then we're going to learn about in the next few verses, which I'm going to save for next week. I don't want to go late tonight. And we'll find out, the weirdness of what had happened to his daughters in his life. When you live around people, God says that bad company corrupts good manners, I believe is the King James. But living and being around people that are not moral, not good believers, eventually it rubs off on you. And I mean, I have learned this experientially. I stayed around some people that which I thought would eventually become believers, and they did not. And and then you start picking up on their behaviors, and it seems like his daughters picked up on some of the behaviors that they learned while they were in Sodom. And the choice to live in Sodom is still kind of interesting to me. I don't quite understand why he would choose such a place to live, but he did. So, and we're going to see more of the consequences of some of the things Lot did next week. So, Heavenly Father, thank you for your love. Thank you for your word that you are so gracious to us and share with us in such abundance, and how we see things, the consequences of behaviors and the consequences of wonderful people. And each day is in our lives is our opportunity to try to make good decisions. We get to make decisions every day, and we always try to do the next best thing when something goes right. Well, what's the next best thing to do? What can we do next that's best? Help us with our decisions, Father. Thank you for this night. Thank you for these wonderful people and the love they have in their hearts to be a part of this fellowship, and for your grace and mercy on all of us. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.